Hey there, and welcome to the Confident Woman Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Brooks. Join me as I sit down and chat with co-hosts, friends, and carefully curated guests and talk about all the things that empower you to become your best and most confident self. So, let's get started.
We've all heard the sayings that your pain becomes your purpose and your mess becomes your message. And I believe there can be a lot of truth in both because I've lived it. Some of the hardest things we walk through can become the very places where God meets us, changes us, heals something in us, and eventually allows us to reach back for someone standing where we once stood. There is something powerful about realizing the thing that you thought would only ever be a part of your pain can become part of how another woman finds hope. What I don't think we talk enough about is what happens after that. When you recognize the purpose in something and now have to decide what it looks like to actually steward it well and possibly even again. You see, when God called me to write Chasing Perfection, that book had to begin with me. I needed to tell the truth about my own life and face the perfectionism, shame, fear, and beliefs I'd carried for years about who I was and what made me worthy. Writing it became a part of reclaiming my voice and rebuilding my confidence, the first inkling of confidence. I didn't know what I was rebuilding because I didn't know what confidence felt like. And so the story itself helped free me from the baggage and the bondage so that I can redeem what God had called and equipped me here for, with, and on purpose. And the minute that women started reading it and telling me they saw themselves in my story, that's when I got to see God in my story. That's where I got to see what God had planted and why He told me to write this story. And something I had once felt ashamed of became something God could use to help another woman feel less alone, and that changed the way I understood purpose. That became the heart behind so much of what I've created afterward. I wanted to make room for the women who felt overlooked, less than, ashamed of where they've been, or unsure whether her story or even if she mattered. And as more women connected with that message, I wanted the reach to go further. More women hearing the conversations, reading the book, finding the podcast, walking into the room, and recognizing something of themselves in what was being shared felt like a natural extension and expansion of that mission. Wanting meaningful work to grow isn't necessarily the problem. The part I've started looking at more honestly and closely lately is how easily growth can become the measure of whether we're stewarding that purpose well. And that shift is so easy to miss because the motive underneath it can still be good. It could have the good intent, have the purest of hearts. But little by little, that tiny shift over time is when we start to veer off course, when things start to change, when you start to change. And when the message matters, you want people to hear it. And when the work is helping women, you naturally want to help more women. But somewhere in that process, bigger can start feeling like proof that you're doing something right until reach, opportunity, visibility, and impact, they all start blending together. Like I said, those micro shifts, all of a sudden we have veered off course, we've gotten off track, we have lost the plot. I'm not saying that in all cases, but it is hard for us to follow God 100% trustfully and blindly and not also look at our own track. Because our eyes should be focused on Him, right? But in reality, realistically speaking, we don't. Our eyes come off of Him. And when we put our eyes on our own path and we keep checking over to make sure that we're aligned, we think that we're doing the right thing until we're not. And that's when things start to get muddy. And that's the part of where the purpose, although it may still feel very, very real, but the way we interpret our responsibility to it can change. And so it brought me back to this moment where years ago, I was chasing, the name of the book is Chasing Perfection. I was so hungry after that. It felt like this freedom that God had called me to heal and restore and gain confidence. Finally, for the first time in my life, I felt alive and I was hungry. I was driven. I was this go-getter, growth getter, goal getter. I wanted the world. I was so hungry to make this mission happen. I was so hungry to make this impact. I was so hungry for women to be nourished and fed. I had such an abundance that I wanted to just give it freely. But I needed to create this platform, these opportunities, these stages, these programs, these courses. I had to create. Or so I thought. I thought that my mission and my legacy was to go big, because I wanted to reach and impact as many people as possible. And so I think that my eyes went onto other people's pages and papers, and that's when I started to follow, okay, you have to do this, you have to do X, you have to do Y, you have to build this, you have to create this. And I remember at the prime of this moment that I was in, everything was all about more influence, more impact, more women, more this, more that. Then I remember hearing this song years ago, Josh Wilson's song, Dream Small. I remember it came on one of my Spotify channels. And the minute I started listening to the words, I resisted it almost immediately, because small meant something completely different to me then. I was thinking that, oh my gosh, what a stupid song. How could this Christian song be all about small things, small dreams, small moments, small, when we serve an infinitely abundant God who is so big that he has blessed us with all the things, right? I just had this different perspective and this whole different view. And I think it's because I was living so small for so long that I couldn't possibly even imagine ever going back to that or even thinking that way. And so I resisted this because small meant something completely different to me then. And I had already spent years shrinking myself, questioning whether I belonged in the room, staying quiet and letting other people tell me who I was. I began finding my voice, growing in my confidence, and sharing my story, and stepping into a life that felt aligned with who God created me to be, the big God, right? And so the idea of dreaming small sounded like going backward. And I couldn't understand why God called me out of hiding only to ask me to become smaller again. Or at least that's how I perceived this. And so listening to this song now, completely different woman, different season, different chapter of my life, different experiences. I'm completely different. So as I find myself listening to this song now, I hear something I couldn't hear then. I had confused small with insignificant. I thought the opposite of playing small had to be living big, when maybe the real opposite of playing small is living faithfully. There is a huge difference between shrinking because you don't believe you're worthy of taking up space and recognizing that some of the most beautiful things God asks you to do may never look impressive to anyone else. I've thought about that a lot lately with these everyday, ordinary moments, the mundane, the boring, the unsexy stuff that we do. I've spent time walking through different seasons where you don't know the light that you are shining. You don't know the light that you carry within and how bright that light is and how contagious that is when you're just showing up and being you. I was in a season where I was volunteering. I saw this individual sitting alone. All I had to do was bring a smile, a hello, a short conversation, and there's nothing public about it, right? It didn't have to get filmed, didn't have to be put on Instagram, it didn't have to be documented, it didn't have to do any of that stuff. Scripture says you don't need to tell your right hand what your left hand is doing. You don't need to tell what good deeds you've done, because that's your only reward that you'll ever get here. But your eternal reward is awaiting in heaven. And so you live by Scripture, you live by word, and you live by the truth. But we are flawed, and so sometimes we mix those two. And I get it because we see this every single day. But the point of this is that there's nothing public about any of this. And there's no way to measure what it meant. I don't know when someone last stopped by to speak to that person, or who visits them when they're lost, or whether a few minutes of being seen changed anything about their day. I don't know, and I'll probably never know. But that's the point of bringing the light that is within you. Showing up in the small, ordinary, everyday moments, smiling, extending an open heart and an open door, random acts of kindness, being the salt of this earth. I don't know if for those few moments of interaction that I had with this individual, just letting them feel seen, conversing, treating them with dignity and respect as a human being, I don't know if any of that actually makes a difference. It had me thinking differently, though, about how quickly we dismiss things as small and simple because there isn't a visible outcome attached to them. And then I'm reminded of 1 Peter 4:10 says, each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. The word steward changes the whole conversation for me because stewardship isn't ownership. If God entrusted something to me, my responsibility isn't to squeeze every possible ounce of success, visibility, growth, or significance out of it. My responsibility is to use it faithfully. And faithfulness isn't always going to look the same from one season to the next. There will be seasons when stewardship means building and stretching and just taking the opportunity to the next level, allowing God to expand something far beyond what you could have done on your own. And there may also be seasons where an opportunity can be good and still not be yours. And when something can be growing while the way that you're carrying it no longer reflects the life God is asking you to live, that's okay. We can change. Our purpose change. Our direction change. Just as these seasons and these chapters that we're in, purpose can be real while the way we handle it can become tangled up into our identity. And that puts a lot of pressure to prove, or possibly even the fear that if we stop pushing, we're somehow wasting what God gave us. But that's just a lie that we're telling ourselves. Because God didn't create us to be one thing all the time. He knows life is going to happen. He knew this before we were born. And so when we're trying to hold on to the one certainty, the one outcome, the one identity, the one purpose, we've missed out on what He's actually called and equipped us for. And that's where I think we have become more honest in asking these questions and getting real with ourselves. It's easy to ask whether something is working when we have numbers that can prove that, but I think it's harder to ask whether the way that we're pursuing it is still reflecting the God who gave it to us in the first place. Does it leave room for the people and responsibilities that He entrusted into us? Does the way I'm living this purpose reflect the values I say matter to me? And am I following God's lead or reacting to the pressure to keep proving the work because it keeps getting bigger? Am I following God's lead or reacting to the pressure to keep proving the work matters because it keeps getting bigger? Matthew 6:33 has always been an anchor for me because it reminds me that there is an order to all of this. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all of these will be added to you. Even something he, the maker and the creator of all things, that he gave us to do, can become disordered when the calling starts taking the place of the relationship it came from. Or when we begin carrying the whole thing as though its success depends entirely on us. And none of that is true. We know this, but yet somehow we don't know it. You know what I'm saying? And it's wild how we know what we need to do. We know what is true. Those little subtle shifts veer us away. And then we think it depends entirely on us, and it doesn't. And this is why those sayings about pain becomes purpose and mess becomes message need stewardship, not rejection. We're not rejecting any of this. There is a time and a season God can redeem what we've lived through and use it in ways we could never have imagined. The question is, what do we do with what he gives us once we recognize the purpose in it? Not every painful chapter has to become public. Not everything that we've gone through has to be shared for the sake of being vulnerable or being liked or putting our life out there for attention or for the significance. Not every gift has to be stretched beyond until there's literally nothing left of the person who's carrying it. We don't have to force redemption into the biggest possible outcome because it's not possible to. We have to stay close enough to God to know what he's asking us to do with all of it. And how do we steward it well? And that could look like writing a book or sharing the story or talking about the hard stuff with boundaries, with respect, with limits. Because I know that we live in a world where we are just, everything goes nowadays. Things are just being shared for the sake of sharing when there is no filter, when there is no message, when there is no point to it. And we're just starving for attention in a world that is hurt and screaming for attention. And so when you're asking God, what do I do with this? Sometimes it's not in a season to be shared. Maybe it's in a season where you retreat and you sit with it and you sit with him and you process what is going on. And he begins healing you and showing you. And little by little, you get repaired. And those are the pieces of the healing that you get to share with the next woman, that in their season, there's hope, there's light, there's encouragement. There's something better on the other side. But we have to get through, whether that's sharing your truth in your testimony, sharing your story, speaking up and speaking out, building a business around something that you have learned, and now people want to pay and have access to that information, wisdom, knowledge, and insight, or you developed a product or a service that solves the problems that you've gone through. All of this is for him, by him, and from him. So having these conversations, you're empowering other people. You're serving the person in front of you, or you're allowing something to remain between you and God. And that is private, and that is fine. All of this needs discernment. And I share this because when we're in these seasons, we don't know what to make of it. It could feel confusing. It could feel like a whirlwind. Some storms are just very heavy. Some storms last for what feels like eternity, and some storms just last for a blip. Either way, the form can change. And the scale and degree can change. And at any moment, the assignment can change without the purpose becoming less meaningful. So if we use the size of the audience to tell us whether we're faithful, or how many likes or shares, or how many people fill the rooms, or buy the tickets, or are in the seats, we don't need that measurement because we're remaining faithful to the one who provides. We always will be vulnerable to believing that more must be better. But that's not always what truth is. If you know you have purpose, but feel pressure around what you're supposed to do with it, I don't think the question is whether you need to dream bigger or smaller. I think the better question is whether you're stewarding what God gave you in a way that still looks like obedience. So are you protecting the life He gave you while living the calling He placed on you? Can you still recognize the difference between what God is asking of you and what pressure, comparison, ambition, or expectation is asking of you? Or even you are asking of you? My belief is in purpose, it hasn't changed. I believe our stories matter. I believe in being a witness and telling the truth. It's our lived life and our lessons learned. And I believe that God can use the hardest parts of our lives to help someone else find hope. And that there are times when He asks us to step out, to build or speak or create, and allow the work to grow. And what I'm questioning is the assumption that faithfulness can be measured by how large we make the thing He gave us. How big is it? What's our target? What's our follower? What's our, the measurements? How do we measure success? How do we measure impact? How do we measure meaning? How do we measure faithfulness? Because stewardship keeps bringing the purpose back to Him and allowing Him to define what enough is, what growth, impact, and obedience look like in the season we're actually living. I've linked the Becoming Identity Planner and Journal in the show notes. It gives you space to slow down, look inward, and ask honest questions to get the clarity that you and God are aligned on where you're at, what you need to reconnect with, and who you are and whose you are, and make sure the life you're building still reflects what matters most. So until next week, take care and God bless.
Hey there. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the Confident Woman Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode as much as I did, please be sure to like, subscribe, and leave us a review. Thanks again for listening.